units from Rhino itself. And while this is opening, I hope you guys also open the program and follow along. All right. So one note about Grasshopper, some of you opened it for the first time last week. And what you do see when you open Grasshopper in the beginning is basically a series of tutorials that are provided for you. And these are quite useful. It gives you some general information about what the platform is. So if you click on any of them, it would basically allow you to get started. Now, they are meant to kind of highlight different ways that you can do inputs and outputs. These files are stored within your Grasshopper's installation folder. I would say the tutorials that we're going over in this class, they're definitely more in depth, but if you ever wonder what these things are, these are default tutorials for you. But we're going to start from scratch. So to close this file, you could go up here in this upper right corner and just X out of it and start fresh. All right, so we're gonna continue with this concept called lists. And this is something that I've been hinting to in our introductory tutorials. You've definitely heard a little bit of it in the first assignment that you submitted. And it's the core focus of your second assignment submission. And this is where Grasshopper kind of overtakes what Rhino capabilities are, and we really start to understand how we're looking at information that you're constructing as series of 2- or 3-dimensional matrices. So with that, I'm going to go to my perspective view and start by looking at our point construction. So points are a great way for us to always just communicate what we're trying to do, and we're going to construct a point in Grasshopper. So go to your vector tab. Go to your vector tab, go to your point subtab, and grab a component called construct point. So that's vector tab, point subtab, and construct point. And you want to just drag and drop that on canvas. You've already done this many times, part of the tutorial, part of our introductory lessons. And we already know that this one takes one input from X, one from Y, one from Z, and it provides 1 point. So nothing really new at this point. Let's grab a canvas. So you want to double click on your, let's grab a panel, double click on canvas and use a quotation mark, enter. We know that we could also grab panels from our parameters under input, and you can grab a panel. So far, we're looking at a point as 0, 0, 0. This is something you saw in the tutorial. Then the way that this is constructed, if you right click on either one of these inputs, we know that this number is preset here, right? So one input for X, one for Y, one for Z, it gives you 1 point. But what if we change how many inputs we have here? So grab a panel and you want to double click on canvas, quotation mark. This time, before you press enter, enter a number. Let's say 5, enter. So this is an addition to our shortcut. So not only I use double click and quotation mark to get a panel, I could also enter a number, and that becomes the number in your panel. Now, instead of a number, I could do anything. I could also write text. So for this panel, the type of my data, it really doesn't matter. But just know that that's one way that you can add information. So again, this is a panel with number 5 here. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Because right when you were talking about attendance, my computer shut down. You were saying something about that. So people, if they log off or something, and it just happened to me.
Yeah. So can you add your name right now to chat?
Okay.
Please? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
So right now this is type of an input. So please connect it to the X input, right? So we're overriding that 0, which was inherited here with number 5. We already know this. We also know that we could substitute this with a slider. So let's make a slider. Let's use the shortcut that we were looking at last session. Let's make a slider that starts from 0, less than 5, less than 10. So 0, less than 5, less than 10. It gives you a slider with those parameters. So connect the slider to the Y input, right? So right now I have one input going in, an X, one Y, and then it gives me this. So nothing extraordinary at this point. But what if instead of one input here, double click on the panel, I have two inputs going in? So there's two ways I could do this. I can either modify the content of the panel here, or what if we use this slider as the second type of input? So let's change this number to maybe 3. So I have 5, 3. So I want to connect the slider input as well to the X input here. So if you grab a panel outside or from the slider and connect it to the X coordinate, you're going to see that it's going to disconnect your panel by default. So by default, every Grasshopper component could take one input at a time. So when I'm connecting this one, that's replaced. When I'm connecting this one, that's replaced, right? However, if you want to have two inputs at a time, you want to hold shift, and you should see this green arrow with a plus sign appearing. So drag a wire from the slider to the X input. Now, all of a sudden, we have 2 points created. So I'm going to do this one more time. I'm going to disconnect. If you remember disconnecting, you can either right-click on the input, go to disconnect, and it gives you option to disconnect all or disconnect one at a time. So in this case, I can disconnect slider. Or we were looking at a shortcut. If you hold Control, you can disconnect a wire as well. So by default, you can connect one input. If you want to connect more than one, you hold Shift and connect the second one. And if you want to disconnect, you hold Control and you can disconnect wire. And this works for any component, right? So if you're trying different combinations, what we want to end up with at this point is 2 wires from the slider going into X inputs. So again, hold Shift, connect, and 1 wire going into Y inputs. So as soon as I do that, I have 2 points that are being generated. And if I look at the coordinates here, it gives me 2 points. And the first X that it's inheriting is the X that's coming from the panel. The second one is coming from the slider. So if I move the slider, you'll see that the second input, as well as the Y number, is going to change. So what we can clearly see here is that this organization of points, they're not based on which number is smaller or larger, but it's based on which wire has been connected first. So what do I mean by that? If I disconnect these both and connect this first, right? Then I connect the panel, then the order is going to also swap. So order that you choose for connecting your wires, it is also determining how your data is being constructed. Let's add one more step here so that could become a little bit more clear to us. I'm going to select these 2 components, so your construct point component and your panel component. And I'm going to use another panel in between here. So before I connect this to the X coordinate, I'm going to add another panel. So double click here and use a quotation mark. Now I want to use it as a way of looking at what is it that's being processed inside X. So I can do 2 things. I can either connect the wires with the same order here, or I want to show you guys this really useful shortcut. If you have a wire, one wire or a bunch of wires going into an input or an output, you can move them all together and connect it to another input or output. And this becomes really useful because very soon you might have, I don't know, 10 wires going into one, 20 coming out of another one, right? So the shortcut, hold Control Shift together, and you can move one or multiple wires together and connect it to another component. So I'll do this one more time. Currently, I wanna, instead of connecting it here and blindly kind of accept what's happening here, I wanna run it through the panel and then run it through the X coordinates. So basically, I wanna have the same connection, but run it through the panel. So sure, I could do it by reconnecting it here, but this is a really useful shortcut for you to move a bunch of wires from one input to another input. So hold Control Shift together, hover over the grip here, and connect it to this input here. So now I see that when I'm connecting this, depending on what is connected first and what is connected second, so I'm going to hold Shift again, I'm creating this thing called a list, which has this thing called indices. So this is an index number, this is an index number. An index number always starts from 0. So when I then connect that as the X input, basically that is the information that's assigned to X, right? So let's try one more thing. Let's make a copy of the slider. So select the slider, do Control C, Control V, and you can change the number, and it could be any number. Then let's connect this as well to your X panels. So again, hold Shift, connect this as an input. Now that becomes the third number here. So the first one is coming from the panel. This one is the second input, then the third input. And I also get another point. So what is a conclusion we can make here?
Professor, why does your panel have like these two lines that connect to your coordinate construction point?
So this is called a fancy wire. So this is how all of your wires should look. So this is a setting that we have to turn on. If you go to your display menu, you want to have this option called Draw Fancy Wires on. And you definitely want to have this on for this assignment. Otherwise, you guys are not going to be able to, and I'm going to explain why this is happening again. I hinted to it last week. But you definitely want to see double wires coming out of this panel and going into this other panel, right? So does anybody remember what the difference between single and double wire is? So if I look at this panel here, right, I have one number coming out of this. Here I also have one number. Here I have one number, right? So anytime that you're working with a component, whether it's a panel, whether it's, in this case, construct point, right? When you are working with singular data, singular item going into a panel as input or output, that is going to be a single line. But when I connect 5 and then 4 and then 8 and however many I do after this, if I were to disconnect, you'll see that even when I have 2, that becomes a double wire. So in Grasshopper, we're working with either one or more than one, right? When you have more than one data in a list, so this is called a list, then you are working with double wires. So what are some conclusions we can make here? Grasshopper is a visual algorithmic editor, and it kind of indicates by using these lines and this, let's say, visual cues, what is happening with your data. When we are connecting multiple things together, you are starting to create this thing called a list. A list always has this thing called an index. An index always starts from 0. So this is universal to any computational calculation. You always start counting from 0, right? We also have the content here. So this is a number that could change. So my content of the list could change. However, my indices don't change, right? So this is the number that's assigned to each item. We're also seeing something else. Even though I only have one Y input and one Z input, So I have 3 numbers going into X, 3 numbers going into Y, sorry, 3 numbers going into X, 1 number going into Y, and 1 number into Z. How many outputs I have? 3, right? So my number of outputs are always going to be same as my longest list. So if I disconnect this, my number of outputs are still going to be same as my longest list. So this is a list of 1, this is a list of 1, but because this is 2 items, it gives me 2 points. I'm going to connect this back again, and I can continue this on and on and on. So I can make another copy of the slider, change the number slightly, hold down Shift to connect this back. That becomes another point, right? So this is a really important principle, and I'm going to elaborate on this in the next example. But what we learned in this short exercise was how to connect more than 1 inputs into a component. So we learned that if you hold Shift, you can connect more than 1. If you hold Control, you can disconnect. So hold Shift to connect more than 1, Control to disconnect. We also learned how to move number of wires together. So if you hold Control Shift, you can move a bunch of wires from one to another. So the reason that we have this is that because this is understood as text. I'm going to move it back here. There it is. So that's Control Shift. We also learned this thing called longest list matching, which I'm going to elaborate on. And that's kind of the main principle of how Grasshopper is set up. Any specific question about what we see here? Otherwise, I'm going to elaborate on these concepts going forward.
Could we change the order other than
Yes.
by connect?
Yeah. So we can change the order with some really advanced processes under sets, under lists. So anything that has to do with list management, which is the topic of what we're going to be covering this week, you can certainly, after your list is constructed, you can do that by using components under set. However, that would require a little bit more of an operation, and definitely it's one of the steps which you will see in your second tutorial, where you have a list that you're starting with, but you want to change the order, right? So we can reverse the order. We could do a number of things there. But what I want you guys to let me finish. So one thing that I just want you to take away from this is your order of connecting is really important, right? So if I, instead of this, if I connect this one first, that becomes the first point that I see there. After that, I'm going to just switch here, and then let's say here, and then here, right? So I could either go back and resort this, but it kind of doesn't matter. What your program sees is how these are constructed. So I know that I harp on about you need to have a panel. You always need to look at your data, because if you don't, then you might kind of miss certain things, right? So for the sake of this exercise, I'm going to connect them based on the order that they're set up here. So again, hold Shift, hold Shift, hold Shift. Go ahead.
Oh, I just had a question about like submitting.
Can you wait for that question?
Plugins,
I'm in the
like
middle of a
plugin.
tutorial.
Oh, okay, I was just gonna ask, like,
You can, yeah, go
if
ahead.
there's a plugin that we have,
There's a plugin that you
like,
have.
does that affect the file when you open it?
No, it doesn't.
If
So
there's a
unless,
plugin, oh, okay.
So unless you are using a component in your definition, so unless you drag and drop something in this definition, and in that case, I'm still going to get an error telling me that this is using a component that I don't have. And with certain advanced plugins, it tells you that you can download it from here, right? Now, if I don't do anything about it and bypass, then it would just delete that component. So also sometimes you might come across older component. Maybe I'm using an older version of Grasshopper. In that case, under solution, you would go to, there will be an option for you to upgrade your components, which is here. So right now that's not the case. So that's something that's always going to be communicated with you through messages. All right, so I'm gonna move forward. So with this, I'm gonna just window over what we have here. I'm gonna do Control G to group this together and say this is introduction to multiple points and lists. So I'll keep this in the definition. Now, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm gonna start a new file, and I'm gonna upload this separately so you guys could look at it, let's say, along with this video tutorial. So I'm gonna go to File, make a new document. Now, sometimes maybe you wanna make a new file and maybe what you're working on hasn't been saved. So Grasshopper is really, really good at either saving recovery or not overwriting your file. So if I don't know what happened to my file, maybe you made a mistake, you forgot to do something. If you go to this upper right corner, you can have many files open at the same time. So if I then go to this upper right corner and pull up the old file, that just comes in and then it shows me the preview. But I can also go back to the old one. Now, for some reason, if you don't want to have the other file open, you could just, when you want to go to the new one, you could just X out of it. And again, it's always going to ask you whether you want to save it, go for it, and there's your new file. So when you open a new document, it's not like Rhino that you can only have one instance at a time, right? In Grasshopper, you can have tens of instances open here. You just need to go to this upper right corner and call the definition. Okay, so we're going to look at building on this idea of longest list matching, but we're going to, with that, work with a new geometry type. So everybody go to Rhino and let's make a curve that we want to reference. And I'm going to make a new layer in my Rhino layers. I'm going to call one of them curve 1. When I upload this for you, you'll also see the Rhino file. And then another one, I'm going to call it curve 2. So that's all we're going to need, 2 curves on different layers. So for the first one, I'm going to activate the layer, and in Rhino, I'm going to draw some kind of a curve. It really doesn't matter what it looks like. You can do a single line, you can do a polyline, you could also do an interpolated curve. So in this case, I'm going to use an interpolated curve component by going to our curve menu, go under freeform, so that's curve freeform, and use a command here called interpolate points. So that's curve freeform interpolate points, and just click on your Rhino environment a couple of times, and that gives you an interpolated curve. And it really doesn't matter what it looks like. You can modify it later, but this is something that we're just creating in Rhino. At the same time, I'm going to make a secondary curve. I'm going to double click on the second curve. And in this case, I'm going to draw a straight line. So here I have an interpolated curve and a straight line. To draw a straight line, I can either use the icon of line, or I can use my menu, go to curve, line, single line, or use the command from command line, line, enter, and provide a start point and an end point. Okay, so these are 2 different geometry types, but both of them are under umbrella of curves, right? So we know that line, for instance, is a type of curve, but it's a 1-degree curve, and an interpolated curve is a 3-degree curve. If you guys don't remember what I'm talking about, if you select these curves and in command line type rebuild, we have these parameters, right? So number of control points, a line by default has 2, so that's the number you see in parentheses, and the degree is 1. So 1-degree curves are curves such as line, polyline, or anything that is using straight segments. I'm going to cancel. And in Rhino, with NURBS geometry, control points are quite important for you to have smoothness. So if I use the command rebuild for the interpolated curve, and again, in parentheses, this is what you see. So this is 6 control points and with the 3 degree. If I were to change the degree, obviously the topology of this is changing. So the preview option allows you to play with different parameters. We're not going to change the parameters for this, but I just want you to remember this concept of degrees. So let's reference these. To reference geometry, we always do that by using a container of that specific type. So if you go to parameters under geometry, we can either use a curve container or we can use a geometry container. It's true that there's also a line container, but for the sake of this tutorial, I want to use a curve container so that we are also remembering that line is a type of curve. So go under parameters, geometry, curve, drag and drop a container here. So these are empty containers. They are just used for you to bring geometry into your Rhino, from Rhino to Grasshopper environment. It's orange. It means that it's still missing data. And to reference the interpolated curve, you want to right click on the container, go to right click, go to set one curve and select the interpolated curve. So because my color of the layer is red and Grasshopper by default does this red preview, it's a little bit difficult to see the difference, but if I change the color, you see kind of this double preview, right? So this is an issue with Rhino Grasshopper when you have geometry that's in Rhino but also referenced in Grasshopper. You might see this kind of confusing overlay. Just always remember that the red version is the Grasshopper one. So to separate this, annotate this, select the curve that you just referenced, select the component and do Control G. So Control G for grouping it. And I'm just going to add a description here that this is the interpolated curve. And we want to reference the second line. So I can either copy paste this component, clear the value here and re-reference this, but let's do this one more time. If you go to parameters, geometry, grab another curve container. And this time we want to right click on it, go to set one curve. And this time, this is the line that we're looking at. I'm going to repeat this one more time. If you make a mistake, select maybe another curve. You can always think about this as a box, right? A box, a container that is taking your geometry and it's storing the geometry ID. If you right click on it, if you go to this option called clear values, you're able to, this is called dumping data. So you're able to dump the data out of this container. To re-reference, you right click again, go to set one curve and select it again. Now I want to annotate this, so select it, Control G, and then we want to call this line curve. So next thing, let's look at what is the information that's printed in a panel. So double click, get a panel for your interpolated curve. And get another panel for your curve geometry and connect these and read what it's telling you. Both of them are telling you that this is a reference curve. And it is also describing a little bit more. So this one is reference, but it's a planar curve. So what's a planar geometry? And this could be planar curve, planar surface.
2D?
Not necessarily 2D, but your thinking is correct. So the kind of the key is on this, right? Planar. So you're almost right. So what that means is that your geometry's control point is on the same plane. So I could still be planar, but not on X and Y. So I can, let's say, rotate this 90 degrees, right? And it's sometimes a little bit difficult to talk about curves as 2D or 3D because it kind of depends on how you're looking at it. Still, it's the same geometry, but I rotated it. It's still planar curve because all the control points, if you were to project them on a panel, on a plane, it's going to be all on the same plane, right? So it's either XY plane, XD plane, whatever that might be. Now, I'm going to do Control Z. If you select your curve and select one of the control points and move it up, now this is not a planar curve anymore, right? So this is called non-planar curve. So this is important because sometimes a certain type of geometry, let's say, you know, whether you're creating I don't know, a surface through a curve, it might require for it to be planar, right? So in that case, you just need to project it back. So it really doesn't matter whether this is planar or non-planar. Just know that reference there. I'm going to do a Control Z so it goes back to the way we had it. Then let's look at the second one. It says this is a reference line-like curve, line-like curve. So it's a line, but it's a line-like curve. So this is kind of Grasshopper's way of saying that this is still type of curve, but it's line-like. But what we know is that this is kind of a descriptive way of describing this. So this is not something that I can feed into another component, right? All right, so let's go back to what we've been discussing, which is concept of list. This is containing, we have two containers here, but each of the containers have one element stores. So therefore, you have a single line coming out of it and connecting to the panel. Also, in this thing called a list, their index is just 0, right? One item here with a description. So similar to what we did earlier, I can also reference both of these with one single container. So let's try that this time. Go back to your parameters, geometry. And again, I can get a curved container. And this time, instead of referencing them one and then another, you want to right click on it, go to set multiple curves, then select them in whichever order you want. It doesn't matter. Whichever one we select first is going to become the first item of the list. Let's try, for instance, the planar one, and then the line-like curve. Right click or enter. I'll do this one more time. I'm going to clear value. You have the same container, right? For this container, it really doesn't matter whether you're referencing one or many. However, if you right click on it, and instead of one, tell it set multiple curves, select one curve, then another one, right click or enter. Now they look identical, right? There's no way for me to know this one has one, this one has two. But when I look at the information that's coming out of it, so connecting it to a panel, we do see that double line. So there's more than one item. There's two items here. And the order that we see here is based on how they're referenced. So you don't need to do this, but if I repeat the same process, set multiple curves and select this one first, then this one, guess what? That's going to be the first item for you to look at, right? So I'm repeating this because it's quite important to always just think about basically how your information is organized. So think about it as the way you can copy paste things, the way you're attaching things. Always there's an order associated with your content. Okay, so for this exercise, I'm not gonna use this structure. So if you have this component here, right click on it, go to clear values. And we're gonna now use this in a similar way that we did with the points. We're gonna store them in a place. So take your empty container, and I'm gonna put them right in the middle. And this time we're gonna practice how to connect more than one container to another container. And you could use these containers, think about them as geometry blocks or data blocks. So connect the first one. So it shows you the reference planar data. Then if I want to connect the second one, we need to remember that always we need to hold shift. So hold shift, connect the second one, and we see the same information, right? So your container can reference things from outside, or it could also store information that you're carrying it through in your definition. So sometimes this is very useful because you are going to end up writing definitions that are scattered all over your canvas. And by using a container of this sort, you can store it from one place and then take it, or let's say reshuffle it however you want, right? So in this case, we're going to group these container and the panel together, select Control G, and say this is storing more than one item in a container, in the curve container. Okay, so, but the truth is that this is creating a duplicate, right? So I already have them referenced here. This is creating a duplicate. So select your second container, and we're going to turn it off, and we're going to continue with the single items, and we're going to build more things over the curve. So select your this multiple container, right click and turn off the preview, or remember the shortcut is Control Q, or if you use your middle mouse button, you can also turn on and off the preview this way. So this is for preview on, this is for preview off. So we want to have the preview off. So just one subtle thing that I hope you're starting to notice: when the preview is off, color is slightly darker than when the preview is on. You might not notice it first, but even if you zoom out, this becomes a quick way for you to compare the colors, and you know that, okay, there's something here that's turned off. These are turned on, right? So I'm going to move this box or this group and move it up here, and we're going to continue from this point on. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to take each of these curves and we're going to divide it into number of segments, and then we're going to draw lines between them. So this is beginning of how your assignment 2 is going to be set up. To divide the curve into segments, you always want to just think about where you would find that information. For instance, in Rhino, if you go to curve, they are series of commands that are kind of nested under the curve menu. So same thing with Grasshopper tab here. If you go to your curve Grasshopper tab, there's a whole sub-tab dedicated to dividing your curve into different types, different lengths, different segments. So under curve division, we want to use a component called divide curve. Divide curve. So on the curve division, divide curve, drag and drop that on your canvas here. So this component, using the shortcut Control Alt left click, you'll find it under curve division. This component is orange when you drag and drop it because it's still missing information. It still doesn't know which curve to divide, or let's say how many divisions it needs to have. So we're going to start with an interpolated curve. You want to connect your interpolated curve to the curve input. And as soon as you do that, you're going to see 10 segments that are created along your curve. So everybody should see something like this. So you have your interpolated curve reference, divide curve from curve division, divide curve. And when you connect the curve to this curve input, you should see 10 divisions that are created here. Now, this 10 division, this is something that's preset here. So it says number of segments, 10. And this is number, it means if you have 10 divisions and your start and end is marked, you're going to have 11 points along this curve. So this is something we can change. Let's make a slider that goes from, I'm going to double click and tell you guys how to make the slider. So double click, let's make a slider that goes from 1, less than 10, less than 20. So that's 1, less than 10, less than 20. And in this case, we want it to be integers, because this is number of segments, so it doesn't make sense for us to have floating numbers. You can have 1.5 segments, right? It has to be part of the, it has to be an integer. So 1 less than 10, less than 20. it gives you a slider that you can now connect to your count input, connect it to count. And 10 is the same number, so we don't see a difference, but as soon as you start to change number of counts, you'll see what is taking place here. So if I reduce this to one segment, it still gives me 2 points. So everybody reduce this down to 1. And let's go to our outputs and see what we're looking at. And with that, we're going to understand a little bit more about the curve property. So one of the outputs here is the points, and this is the coordinates of the points. Let's grab a panel here to look at the points. And even though I have one number going into here as my count, because this is marking the beginning and end, by default, it gives me 2 points. And you always want to just hover over and read, right? So this is as division points. So this is the start point, this is the end point. Now, how do I know which one is which point? Any idea? So there's 2 different ways that I can find out which point is which, right? Because here I see the coordinates. Well, maybe I can go back and look at my coordinates and think about what is closest to what number, but maybe that's not an efficient way of thinking about this. Another way I can think about this, everything we're creating, it has data associated with that, right? So when you are cutting something or when you're dividing something, so imagine you're taking a piece of wood, right? And you want to measure it and divide it, right? There's always a start, there's always an end. And your geometry, in this case, your curve, it has a start point and an end point. So we looked at this thing called directionality, which we find out under analyze direction, or the shortcut is DIR. And you can see where or how the direction of your curve is set up. So it goes from this point to another point. Obviously, you have a different curve drawn. Yours is going to be different. Now, if I know the directionality, when this is dividing your curve into points, right, into segments, the first item is going to be the start point. The second item is going to be the last point. Now, if I increase this number, you saw that my first item didn't change, right? And the last one doesn't change because those points stay on. But you have more of a distribution along the way. So understanding directionality of your curve, it could give you a clue in terms of how your points are distributed, because you're always starting from the beginning of the geometry. The other thing is, well, what if, you know, it's very difficult to tell and I have many different points. So we're going to look at another component that could tell me what is an index based on each point that I'm looking at. And this is going to be a component that you're going to be using in your tutorial. So if you go to the display tab in Grasshopper, so that's under in your Grasshopper menu under display, there is a component under vector subtab. So that's under display tab, vector subtab. It's called point list. Point list. And if you look at this component, this is going to look quite similar to the way that our custom preview component is set up. That's the component that you saw in your tutorial. Now, what this component does, it takes a series of points, and it could print their indices, right? So what is the order of the points? Now, by default, there is a size input here, but we want to increase this. So we're going to make a slider that goes from 0 less than 5, and I'm going to do 1 point decimal. So that's 0 less than 5 with 1 point decimal. And if you connect it to the size, as you start to increase, you're going to see the indices are printed here. So I see what we just discussed, which was this was the beginning point and that's the end point, right? And this number might be slightly different depending on scale of your curve. And in tutorial, we also go over this. But if I start to increase my number of divisions, you can see that also distribution of the points are marked based on their indices. So now it's good because let's say if I want to do something maybe here for some reason on index 5, I want to do something, I can go and look for that information here, right? So Grasshopper allows you to make things explicitly by using visualization, by understanding how your data is managed. So I'm gonna maybe reduce the size a little bit on 2. And if I don't want to just continue dragging my number up and down, if I want it to be on a specific number, you can always just double click on your slider and enter a specific number and enter. So that just locks it in place. And I'm going to group these 2 components together, Control G. And I'm going to say that this is going to display point order based on index number. This is going to be very useful going forward. All right, so that's pretty that works for us at this point. Now, I want to repeat the same thing for the second line. So at this point, we understand that there's this thing called point order list, and there is this thing called directionality. And we want to also take a look at the same information for the second line. So I basically need to just repeat the same setup for here. So this component, we'll find it under curve, under division, divide curve. You can also copy paste it. So you want to connect your line to the curve input. So we're replicating the steps. Now, by default, when you connect, the count is 10. But what we want to do is we want to take the same slider and connect it to the same count input. So right now, the same slider is controlling how many divisions we have along both of the lines, right? So it really doesn't matter how long it is, but it's the same number of segments. Now, usually here I get a question in terms of, well, what if you do want to fix your divisions? So there are a number of other components under curve division. Let's say if you wanted to have a specific length or a specific distance, you can certainly use other components here. It's just this component doesn't really care about the length of your curve, but about how many segments you want to be left with. So next thing we're going to do for this, we're going to also print the point information on this curve. And with that, we're going to then begin to draw lines between them. So since already this group is created for us, and we have also slider connected to it, I'm going to just make a copy of this and use this instead of resetting this. So you can certainly do that, right? You can copy one item or multiple items. Now, if I want to copy the whole group, I'm just going to window over it, Control C, Control V. And when you do that, it's going to, by default, still be connected to your original points or your original input or output. But we know that we can replace that. So as soon as you take your points from your second component, connect that to the points input. Now we are also displaying the points here. So what I want you guys to look at, we want to make sure that your point directions are going in the same direction, right? Some of you, maybe you've drawn one curve this way, the other one the other way. So I can demonstrate that. So maybe you have something like this. So this would be fine, but when we start to draw lines, they are going to be crossing one another. So what I just quickly did here, I did this thing called flip curve. So if you select your curve and type flip, enter, your curve's directionality is changing, right? So you want to make sure that these are at least as much as possible near one another, right? All right, so we could do the flipping operation also in Grasshopper, but for the sake of this tutorial, I wanted to do that in Rhino. Next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna draw lines between these points. And I'm gonna come back here and clean this up a little bit. So I'm gonna take the first divide curve component, and I'm going to add it to this curve. And I'm going to select it and right click on the group box and tell it to add to group. You did this in tutorial 1 quite a lot. And same thing with the second one, you select what you want to add to the group, and you want to right click on the group that you want to add it to and tell it to add to group. So this way, you have a little bit more of a separation between these two operations. All right, so next thing we want to do, we want to draw lines between them. So you drew a line in your assignment 1 from a point to another point. So we are going to need the same component, which is under curve, under primitive. That's curve, primitive, line. And if you guys remember in your assignment 1, you were drawing a line between one single point to another single point. However, in Grasshopper, it really doesn't matter how many times you're asking an operation to take place. What is really important is to be aware of how your data is constructed, and any issues that you might have with the geometry that you constructed has to do with that. So that's what we're going to look at here. To make this clear, instead of connecting it directly from points, I'm going to connect it from our panel here. So then this way it'll be a little bit easier to talk about the data structure. And just so that I'm able to fit everything in one screen, I'm going to go back to my number of counts and reduce this to 4. So I'm only seeing 5 points on each panel. So I have that at 4, 5 points on each. And I'm going to do the same for the second point division. So I have 5 points on one curve, 5 points on the other one. And we're gonna run our wire, instead of going directly from the component through the panel. So connect all the start points to all the endpoints, and we should end up with a bunch of lines between these points. I'm gonna turn off the preview here so you can see that better. So the operation I did earlier about flipping, if you don't have that, right, you might see something like this. And that's because the way that this component is working, it's going off of your list, right? So it takes your first point or item 0, and it's creating a line to the other item 0, right? So if this is kind of twisted, that's what you're going to get. Now, by flipping it back, it's a little bit easier to see. So it's drawing a line from item 0 to 0, 1 to 1, etc. And I talked about this thing called longest list matching. It takes a look at how many elements you have in your list. In this case, I have equal number of points, and it gives you that many lines, right? So 5 points as a start point, 5 points as an end point, it gives you 5 lines. Now, this is something that obviously is parametric. So as I start to increase this, as you can imagine, this could be endless, right? So this is something that you can increase and decrease as much as you want. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. Whatever number you end up, however many points you have in this list, your number of lines are going to be the same. Sometimes if you have panels that are too long, right? Sometimes you might have thousands of items inside a panel. One way, instead of scrolling all the way up and down, you can just hover over your input or hover over your output, and you could see how many elements you have. So 16 elements going in, 16 elements coming out, right? So you're able to compare it that way. Yeah, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to reduce this to 4. And we're going to group this component together, Control G, and we're going to say this is default Grasshopper longest list logic. So far, in a sense, it looks like it's kind of a given, but let's give this a try. What if I don't have the same number of divisions here? So instead of using the same number, let's make a copy of the slider. And I'm going to change it slightly to a slightly different number. So one is 4, the other one is 9. And I'm going to connect it to the second one. So let's see what happens with our lines. So any idea what I'm seeing here? So it starts fine, right? 0 to 0, 1 to 1, 2 to 2, 3, 4. But then after that, it's starting to do what? So it's starting to connect every single one from the longest list to the last item of the shortest list, right? So let's look at our data and try to make sense of this. If I scroll this down, I have my single list, the first one, the start point, which has 5 items, right? Then if I look at the other list, so based on this slider, so I have many more elements in the list, right? So you start from 5 items here. This has 10 items here. So 9 plus 1, since it starts from 0. And I end up with 10 lines here. So this is the longest list logic, right? It starts to connect. Then when it's running out of components to connect to, it just repeats the same item over and over and over again. So we see that here starts fine, and then it repeats this information over and over again. So depending on, let's say, how you want to use this, maybe this is okay, but for most parts, think about this as maybe a railing that you're creating. Obviously, this is going to be problematic, right? So for that, we have a series of components that are set up to help us with this. I'm going to introduce you to the first one today, and we're going to continue with the other two on Thursday. So under set, under list, so these are components that allow you to, let's say, manipulate what is happening inside your lists. And we're going to be using quite a lot of these. And starting with the second tutorial, you're going to be introduced to these. So we have this thing called longest list, which is what I've been mentioning that Grasshopper does by default. But what this component does, it allows you to do a couple of more operations with this. So this is under set, list, longest list. So drag and drop that here. And there's a number of components similar to what you have on their set list. If you start to zoom in, you're going to see this plus and minus signs that are appearing. So these components allow you to work with more than one inputs or more than one outputs, right? So if you do a plus, you can see that it's starting to add, and if you do a minus, it's trying to get rid of it. So for the sake of this exercise, we're going to keep it as is since we already have 2 lists here. So what I'm going to do is, in this case, I'm going to use this component, then I'm going to draw a line. So let's see, I'm going to connect the first list to list A. I'm going to connect the second list to list B. Then I'm going to draw a line. So I can either use this component or grab another one, which I'll do under curve, primitive, line. Then connect your list A to start point, list B to end point. Now, it's a little bit difficult to understand the difference because I still have preview of my lines on. So I'm going to go to the default line and turn it off. So you select, do Control Q or right click and turn off the preview. And what I see here is that, well, it's pretty much the same preview, right? But what this component does, it allows you to change how the default works. So instead of repeat last, if you right click on it, you can also tell it to repeat first. So instead of repeating your list and then matching the end elements, I can do the opposite. So if you click on repeat first, it does the opposite, right? So it starts from the last element of the list and it's matching to the first one. Maybe this is more preferable. Or there's other options here. So anytime that you see a Grasshopper component with this tab, there's more options inside. So let's look at this one called interpolate. And what interpolate does, it tries to find a pattern between your one list and the other one, and it tries to draw between them. Actually, this is quite nice because imagine if you have a railing, if you have a structural numbering, what it does is it just kind of distribute your force much better. So there's a couple of other options as well. So there's the wrap option, which it starts from the beginning and then it matches it. It's a little bit difficult to see how the logic works because the number of elements on each of these are going to be different. But for the sake of this exercise, I'm going to right click on it and go to repeat first, which is the opposite of what the default does. And we're going to group this together, Control G, and say this is longest list component. Expands default functionalities. Okay, so I'm going to save this definition and I'm going to use this to build our tutorial for next class session. I'm going to stop recording at this point. Within minutes, this is going to be uploaded to our file section. And I'm going to ask you next class session to